Hi everybody, welcome back to Newton Community Farm. My name's Hope and it's Wednesday, so it's time for gardening. And we're at the farm today. I have Jay behind the camera and we're here in the learning garden, and then you're seeing the farm production side behind it. And it's kind of overcast. It's a really beautiful morning and it's a good day to do some planting. So we're going to talk a little bit today about direct seeding and what it is and when you can do it and what you can direct seed. First, as always, I just want to mention that we're still doing our healthy harvest bags. So every Friday they're available for purchase online and pick up on Friday afternoons. And every week the content changes depending on what we're harvesting here, and the price changes too. So you can find all that info on the website. And they're really delicious. Everything's fresh and things are growing. So direct seeding, let's talk a little bit about that. So we have plenty to show you in the learning garden today for examples of what you can direct seed and what you can't. But first let's talk about the definition of direct seeding before we do a little walk around the garden. So direct seeding is exactly as it sounds. It's when seeds for plants or flowers are put directly into the soil where they'll be grown and where they'll stay for their whole life cycle. And the opposite of that is transplanting. So that is, seeding indoors under more kind of controlled conditions in a tray or slot trays or little pots. And transplanting is also if you go to your local gardening center and you buy little starter sprouts, little teeny plants, and put them in your garden exactly where you want them. So both routes are plants. Different plants require different things, and some plants like to be transplanted, some plants like to be direct seeded, and some can kind of fall in the middle. And there's obviously different levels of control that's available for each of those methods of planting, and we'll talk a little bit about that today. So let's do a little walk around. So I think a big question, our grapevines are coming in now. I think a big question with direct seeding is what can be direct seeded and what can't. So I think we'll start with what can't because it's right in front of us over here. So this very weedy bed is predominantly tomatoes and peppers. And if you've watched these episodes over the weeks, you've been able to see them grow a little bit. So these are some peppers. You can see they're kind of starting to bush out and they're starting to develop flowers, which is very exciting. And then down here we have some cherry tomatoes. And so peppers and tomatoes are in the same family. They're in the nightshade family. And that family includes eggplant, it includes potatoes, and those are some crops that pretty strictly will want to be transplanted. So if you have these growing in your garden right now, you probably, odds are, transplanted them. Either planted them inside on your own or bought starters at a farm like ours or at a garden center. And they require some pretty specific conditions when germinating, and that's why you would transplant them into the soil after growing them inside and like really nurturing them while they germinate. But there are plenty of things that you can put in your garden that don't require that kind of care and planning, and I think that's why direct seeding is a great conversation to have at this point in the summer. You may be harvesting some things and opening up some space in your garden, and it's a good time to begin thinking about what else you can put in to that open space. So let's do a little walk and take a look at some things over here that I did direct seed, and we can talk about what kind of things can go that route. So right here we have dill, a really tasty herb. We eat the fronds, and these can be cut and they'll come again. So you could, hypothetically, if I wanted to cook with these tonight, I could cut them at the stems here and they'd probably grow back into another nice bushy plant. So these were direct seeded probably early May, and they took a little while to germinate. And as you can see, it's a little bit spotty. So that's one thing that I don't have control over with direct seeding. But for the most part, this is plenty for me and for the purposes of the learning garden. But these patches that you see are where the seeds didn't germinate. So that means that I either seeded a little bit lightly or maybe those seeds didn't get all the right conditions to grow. But right next door, we have this cut lettuce, and this was direct seeded as well. And I direct seeded this without much rhyme or reason. I used a trowel, like the one right here, to kind of dig a furrow, and we'll be planting some seeds right next to this today in this soil, so we can kind of go through what it looks like to direct seed today. But I use a trowel like this to dig some furrows in the soil, and I sprinkled the lettuce seed in, and it actually created a pretty good stand of lettuce. And as you can see, I've been kind of cutting it for harvesting, and this is probably going to be the last cut that I get on this mix. But this was direct seeded, and it definitely didn't grow in as spotty as the dill did. So, you know, I'm thinking about, did I water this as much as I watered this? Was the soil as compatible for the seeds for the lettuce as it was for the dill? So there are a lot of questions that might pop up when you're direct seeding. But these are a few examples. I think we'll take a walk over this way and take a look at another example of direct seed versus transplanting. So like I mentioned in the beginning, there are some crops that can kind of go either way. And in general, the shorter season crops, so we're thinking like radishes and beets and things that can kind of grow pretty quickly and have a quick turnaround, those are typically good candidates for direct seeding. So right here we have bush beans, and beans are another example of direct seeding. So I sprinkled these in early May. Again, I created like a furrow in the center of this raised bed and dropped in the bean seeds, and I thinned them out when they got a little bit more sizable. So it's helpful to know what to look for when your plant starts to grow. Usually I just Google or look on the seed packet or the seed catalog online to see what the seedling will look like, so that when it starts to come up, I can thin it if it needs to be thinned, and I can weed around it so that it's not experiencing too much weed pressure. So as you can see in this row, if you kind of look down it, it's pretty spotty in the middle. So on the far side, there's more beans, and there's actually a rogue tomato plant in there that I'm gonna let grow. And then it's spotty in the middle and more bushy on the sides. So again, you know, there are some things to keep in mind when direct seeding so that you can hopefully get, you know, a more consistent level of plants, unlike the center of this row. So something that I would do, and that I tried to do with this row, is loosen up the soil before I plant. So with this row, I used a broad fork and I loosened up the soil with that. I released any compaction, and that helps the roots have like free, loose space to move around as the plant grows. Especially true with carrots and parsnips and anything that has a long taproot. If you want those perfect straight carrots, it's a good idea to loosen up the soil, move out any rocks or debris, and get the landscape ready for the crops. And I did plant carrots here, and they didn't germinate at all, and I learned a pretty tough lesson from that. There's actually 3 carrots at the end that I left, and we'll see if they are tasty or not. So what I learned with this row is another important consideration with direct seeding is once those seeds get in the soil, to a degree they're going to do their own thing and grow and germinate, but they do need some care and some attention. One thing I try to do is label the row. You can see that I have a bush bean label here, and that's helpful when you direct seed, because it's easy to direct seed, and then while you're waiting for those seedlings to sprout from the soil, it's easy to forget that you planted anything at all and trample over them or walk through the path or whatever it is. So I try to always label where I'm direct seeding, because it helps to remind me that there's something growing in there even though I can't see it yet. And the other big consideration, and this was the lesson with the carrots for me, is to keep the soil very moist, not very moist, but consistently moist while germination is happening underground. I think that's what went wrong with my carrots. Again, I'm just kind of troubleshooting, but nothing really happened and I wasn't really paying attention to giving them a lot of water. It's kind of out of sight, out of mind. So it's nice to set yourself reminders or water that row or that section of your raised bed when you're watering your other crops. It's helpful to plant when there's rain coming, which I think there's some coming this afternoon. So water is a really big thing, and how you water is also a really big consideration. If you turn your hose on full blast and spray down your row, it's likely that you'll shift or like completely spray the seeds away. So I try to use like a wand setting or a shower setting on the hose here at the farm to give some moisture to the soil without disrupting those teeny seeds that don't have any weight to hold them down. So that's my lesson. This is what I've been learning in direct seeding, and I will clear those weeds and try something else, something that can be planted at this point in the season. So I think that's a pretty good segue for talking about what you can, not just variety of crop, but what can be planted in the middle of the summer. So it's July 1st today, happy July, and I'm thinking, so I have this space in this raised bed next to the cut lettuce that I'm gonna plant today. And I was thinking for a little while about planting arugula there. What had been growing there before, if you watched last week, I showed my arugula plants, which were growing right beside this cut lettuce. And they had gone to flower, so they were all done producing. And it was time to pull them out and plant something else there. I was tempted to plant arugula again. I really like having fresh arugula at my access all the time. It's my favorite green. But when we're replanting and replacing things in our garden, which is what we're going to be doing as the summer goes on, most likely, it's a good idea to think about crop rotation. So planting the same crop or a crop in the same family to replace something that you're pulling out of the soil is not always the most sustainable way to go about replanting or direct seeding or whatever it is you're going to do in your garden throughout the season. Crop rotation is when you plant a different crop in place of whatever you've pulled out, ideally something from a different family. So for example, if I have kale in a bed and I want to pull that out, I'm not going to plant more kale. I'm probably not going to plant beets there. I might plant something like lettuce, something that's not related to the first crop that was planted there, and therefore has different requirements from the soil, has different pest pressure, and things like that. So I decided not to plant arugula here. I'm hopefully going to plant it somewhere else. And arugula also doesn't love the heat, and it tends to be more bitter when it's very hot out. So arugula might be something that I plant later in August for a September harvest. But today I'm going to plant some calendula. So that's an edible medicinal flower, and it attracts beneficial insects to the garden, which means that the good insects that eat the bad insects that destroy plants are going to be kind of ushered into the garden, hopefully. And we actually have some calendula growing over here, that orange blossoming along the pathway, and we've been harvesting that pretty abundantly, and it's really healthy for the garden, and it's really beautiful when you start being able to harvest it. So I have some of those seeds in my back pocket, and we're supposed to get some rain this afternoon, so that's what makes me want to plant this morning. I know, it's a good idea to be able to water your seeds right after you get them in the ground, and I think the sky is going to do that for me today. So let's get down to this bed and get some seeds in. So this is the space that I cleared. So this was the arugula, and now it's empty. Because this is a raised bed, I'm not too worried that the soil is going to be compacted. If this were a path like where I have the beans or where I had the carrots, I might take a broad fork or something to the soil just to loosen it up before I plant anything. But I'm not walking anywhere near this raised bed, so I feel pretty confident that the soil is loose, and I can feel it with my hands that it's pretty loose. And before we started filming, I kind of just ran my hands through it and loosened it up. I might You know, these teeny rocks aren't a huge deal, especially with flowers, but I might kind of get rid of some of those. And if I were planting something like turnips or radish here, something that I might want to eat or that I would want to eat, I would probably top this off with a little bit of compost just to give it a little boost of nutrients, especially since it just provided all these nutrients for the arugula that was growing before. But because these are flowers, and I don't really think I'll eat them, I might just cut them like I've been cutting the other ones for bouquets. I'm not going to add any compost. I'm pretty confident that these will be okay to grow. And the other reason that I selected these flowers, this particular variety, is because on the seed packet it tells me that I can, once I plant these in the soil, I can plant 2 or 3 week successions of the seed throughout the summer for continuous blooms. So as my flowers begin to kind of peter out and fall away and stop producing, I can keep seeding this variety of flower for continuous production, which tells me that it's a crop that can handle the heat throughout the summer. Whereas something like arugula might not say that on the back of the packet. So there's lots of information when you buy seeds, wherever you buy seeds, around, you know, how you can plant them and whether or not they can be planted at any point throughout the season. And that's definitely something to keep in mind with choosing crops to plant. If you're trying to grow food at like different intervals throughout the season, it's definitely good to keep in mind what can be planted in the heat. For example, I have peas behind me that are almost done, and I seeded those in April. Peas don't like the heat and they don't produce much in the heat. And so I would either plant them in April or maybe plant them in September for a fall harvest of peas. So with that being said, I'm gonna just plant one row in the front of this calendula. Usually I kind of eyeball when I'm planting. If I'm planting something that I want to be in neat rows and I want it to grow in a specific way, I would use a tape measure. And what I tend to do is, you know, I kind of roll it out and I lock it so that I can mark where I am with the tape measure. So I'll lay it down, kind of nuzzle it into the soil, and then I have this guide set up for myself, because most seed packets will tell you how to plant based on inches, like seeds per inch or whatever, and it's nice to kind of have this guide as I go. So this is what I like to do, and I'm going to plant my rows this way. I planted the lettuce and the dill vertically in the raised bed, but I'm going to go horizontal right now just for ease. So what I tend to do is I take a trowel. If I'm working in a bed on the kind of garden side of the learning garden area, I might use like a hoe of some kind to create a furrow. But what I pay attention to is how deep the seeds should be planted. So some seeds are going to be like 1/8 of an inch, and some seeds are going to be deeper. It tends to depend on the size of the seed. But for these seeds, the packet tells me that they should be 1/4 of an inch deep. So I'm kind of eyeballing that. I could use this tape measure to help me, but I'm going to use the nose of this trowel and just kind of create a little divot in the soil. And I'm not exact by nature, so I tend to garden a little bit loosely, and sometimes it pays off and sometimes it doesn't, so you can be as exact with this as you want to be. So that's looks like 1/4 of an inch to me. And I'm gonna take my seeds, and I know from reading the back of the packet that I should plant 2 seeds every 6 to 12 inches. I tend to seed a little bit heavier than the packet tells me, because you can always come back and thin. So like I said with the beans, once these start to pop up, I'll probably want to go through and pull out any weeds that are popping up too. And while I do that, I might go through and thin. If I have, 3 of these little flowers all nestled together, I might thin out the 2 smaller ones so that one flower can have plenty of space and resources to grow. So I'll follow the directions, but I might go a little bit heavier on the seeds. So this is Calendula, and I want to show you the seeds because they're so cool. I think flower seeds are amazing. They look like little bones with spikes on them. And they're pretty sizable. So it's definitely a good idea to have this burrow for them to go into. So the packet, again, it said plant 2 seeds every 6 to 12 inches, 1/4 inch deep. So using my tape measure, I'll take a couple of seeds and drop them in roughly every 6 inches, because you can always come back and thin them out. And I tend to err on the heavier side with seeding because I'd rather come back and thin than have a situation like the dill where it's just not very thick. So that's my stance on thinning. And my plan, not necessarily in this episode, but my plan is to plant seeds in more rows throughout this whole section of the raised bed. But for today, we'll just do this 1 row together. And I'm gonna move my tape measure out of the way. And when my seeds are ready to be buried into the soil, I'm just gonna take these little mounds that I created with my furrow when I was getting the little trench ready, and I'll just brush the dirt back into where I dug it up from. And then I'm gonna lightly kind of tamper it down and just kind of tuck the seeds in. And then if it were in like a 90-degree hot day, I would give this some water and kind of set it up for like a first successful day of growing. I'm not gonna do that today because there's rain on the forecast. So it's a good thing to keep in mind, watering right away. And that's the demo. That's pretty much how it goes. I think with some things it can be more difficult to get a really solid stand, like with the carrots. I tried to be very exact, but like I said, I didn't give it enough water. That's what I think. So it's kind of an uncertain art, and it's a little bit of a game of trust. It's out of sight, out of mind. You can't really see it, but it's very exciting when things start to come up through the soil. And there's one more thing that I want to talk about in terms of direct seeding. If you're thinking about how to fill space in your garden or in your yard, you can always think about cover crops, because it's best to not leave soil unoccupied like this for very long. In a grander scheme of sustainability and environmental health and soil health, loose soil that has no roots holding it down is much more likely to erode from water or wind or anything like that, and then your soil is losing nutrients, it's losing quantity. So it's a good idea to always have something in your beds if you can. So I have some open space in the learning garden, and I don't really know what I'm gonna put in it, but I'm at least gonna put in flowers or cover crop. So cover crop is a really good thing to be thinking about as the summer progresses and we head towards fall. Rather than leaving a bed open like this is right now, but won't be for long, it's a good idea to think about what kind of cover crops you can put into your soil. So something like peas or vetch, something that will add nutrients to your soil, especially if you've grown a crop or two so far in the growing season. It's a good idea to be thinking about cover crops rather than leaving your beds bare. So I think that's it. Do you have any questions for me, Jay?
Can we see the end result of what calendula looks like when it's in full bloom?
Absolutely. So this calendula it's a good example of a versatile crop, because this calendula was actually transplanted. They were seeded here in the greenhouse, and I planted them a foot apart. and now they're just going totally crazy. These are also medicinal. I don't think these are edible, this variety. But like I said, we've been harvesting them pretty abundantly. And with these, the more you harvest, the more they come up. So if you look closely, you can see all these like beautiful little buds getting ready to emerge. So I think when we're done, we'll harvest a little bit of these.
Great.
And that's that. Yeah, thank you for tuning in. And we're always here on Wednesdays talking about gardening. And hopefully we'll see you next week. Bye.